I am Alia, 32 years old, and sitting in my family corporate boardroom. I watched my father strike a match and set fire to a check for $40 million. It was my inheritance from my grandfather. As the paper curled into black ash, my father sneered, telling me that failures do not inherit the crown. I did not scream. I did not fight back. I just smiled, because what he had actually just burned was the only thing keeping him out of federal prison. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who thought they could destroy your future. Growing up in the affluent enclaves of Buckhead in Atlanta meant that everything was about presentation. To the outside world, the Sterling family was the pinnacle of Black excellence. My grandfather, Elias Sterling, built Sterling Logistics from a single delivery truck in the 1970s into a massive regional supply chain empire. He was a man of immense integrity, sharp intellect, and quiet power. He believed in hard work, and he spent his entire life building a legacy meant to sustain generations. But inside the walls of our sprawling estates and corporate offices, that legacy was being poisoned from the inside out by the very man who inherited it. My father, Warren Sterling, was a man who stood on third base and demanded the world congratulate him for hitting a home run. The air in the boardroom that morning was thick with tension and the expensive scent of my father's custom cologne. The mahogany walls lined with portraits of our company history seemed to close in around us. Desmond, the longtime family lawyer who had served my grandfather for decades, sat at the end of the long glass table. He was sweating visibly, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. He knew exactly what kind of man my father was, and he knew the storm that was brewing. The reading of my grandfather will had been a private, highly contested affair, but today was the day the assets were physically distributed. Desmond reached into his leather briefcase with trembling hands. He pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of paper and slowly slid it across the smooth glass surface toward me. It was a certified cashier check for $40 million. The exact amount my grandfather had promised me for dedicating my 20s to cleaning up the chaotic financial messes my father constantly left behind. I reached out to take what was rightfully mine. Before my fingers could even brush the edge of the paper, my father lunged forward. He snatched the check from the table with a violent swiftness that made Desmond flinch in his seat. My father stood tall, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit, looking down at me with a mixture of absolute disgust and unearned triumph. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver lighter. He struck the flame, held it to the corner of the check, and watched the fire catch. "Failures do not inherit the crown," he sneered, his voice echoing in the large room. "You have spent your entire life questioning my authority, undermining my business decisions, and acting like you are the smartest person in the room. You think because the old man favored you that you can walk away with a piece of my empire. You get nothing, Aaliyah. You are out of the company, and you are out of this family." He dropped the burning check into a heavy crystal ashtray in the center of the table. We all watched as $40 million turned into brittle black ash. The smell of sulfur and burning paper filled the sterile, air-conditioned room. I did not gasp. I did not shed a single tear. I sat perfectly still, my posture relaxed, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I am a lead forensic accountant at one of the top-tier financial firms in the country. My entire career is built on analyzing patterns, tracing hidden funds, and remaining entirely emotionless while exposing the truth. I look at chaotic data and find the narrative. Looking at my father in that moment, all I saw was a highly predictable, incredibly fragile pattern of narcissistic behavior. My father expected me to break down. He wanted me to beg. He fed on the desperation of others because it made him feel powerful. For years, I had been the designated scapegoat of the Sterling family. If revenue dipped, it was because my financial projections were overly conservative. If an investment went sour, it was because I did not warn them adequately. Meanwhile, my younger sister Jada was the golden child. Jada had never worked a full week in her life. She spent her days shopping at Phipps Plaza, lunching at the country club, and funding her lavish lifestyle with company dividends she never lifted a finger to earn. Right on cue, Jada let out a soft, mocking chuckle from her seat across the table. Beside her sat her husband, Connor Pierce. Connor was a white finance bro who had married into our family wealth 3 years ago. He walked around Atlanta acting like he was the sole architect of the Sterling legacy. He was mediocre at best, armed with a degree his parents bought for him and a condescending attitude he weaponized daily against me. He loved to mansplain business to me, completely ignoring the fact that I spent my days auditing men exactly like him for federal fraud. Connor leaned over the table, tapping his luxury watch with an arrogant smirk. "It is time to face reality." "Alia," he said, his voice dripping with that specific brand of racial and gendered disrespect he usually tried to mask as brotherly advice. "You are a glorified bookkeeper. Stick to crunching numbers for other people's money. Leave the heavy lifting and the real corporate strategy to the big boys." Jada placed her hand over his, beaming at him as if he had just delivered a profound piece of wisdom. "You should listen to him," she chimed in, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "Dad and Connor are taking this company global. You always drag the mood down with your constant worrying about regulations and budgets. It is time for you to pack up and move on. Maybe find a nice quiet accounting job somewhere far away from here." I looked at the two of them, a parasite feeding on my family wealth, and the sister who held the door open for him. They were so blissfully unaware of the absolute financial disaster they were sitting on. My father had been bleeding the company dry to fund his offshore ventures, and Connor had been skimming off the top to cover his own failing investments. I knew this because I had traced every single digital footprint they had left behind over the past 18 months. They thought they had successfully boxed me out. They thought burning that check was the ultimate victory, a symbolic execution of my future. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the lines of my tailored emerald green blazer, taking my time. The absolute quiet of my demeanor began to unsettle the room. Desmond was staring at me, his eyes wide, anticipating the explosion he assumed was coming. My father shifted his weight, his arrogant smile faltering just a fraction of an inch as my silence stretched on. I picked up my leather briefcase and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. Every step I took was measured and deliberate. I reached the door, placed my hand on the brass handle, and then I stopped. I slowly turned my head to look back at my father, my sister, and her smug husband. My eyes dropped to the crystal ashtray where the last embers of the check were dying out. "It is a real shame you burned that, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly level and calm, slicing through the tension in the room like a scalpel. "You see, Grandpa Elias knew exactly what you would do. He knew your ego could not resist a theatrical display of power. That piece of paper was not a certified check." My father's brow furrowed. The color began to drain from his face as the realization that he had stepped blindly into a trap started to dawn on him. "You just incinerated the only physical copy of the non-disclosure agreement, keeping the IRS out of your personal offshore accounts," I stated clearly, watching the absolute horror wash over his features. "Without that signed agreement, all the financial protections Grandpa put in place to shield your private Cayman assets are officially null and void as of this morning." Connor dropped his hand from the table. Jada stopped smiling. The deafening silence that rushed into the boardroom was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I looked at the three of them, a fragile house of cards, completely unaware that the wind had just shifted. I pulled open the heavy doors, stepping out into the hallway. "Enjoy your victory dinner tonight," I added, not looking back. "I will see you all very soon." I let the door click shut behind me, walking away from the ashes and stepping into the power I had been building in the shadows all along. The adrenaline of the boardroom confrontation had not faded by the time I navigated my car through the heavy Atlanta traffic. The sprawling glass and steel towers of Midtown approached, reflecting the harsh afternoon sun. I had just dropped a bomb that would shatter my father's carefully curated reality, but I knew Warren Sterling better than anyone in this city. He would never simply surrender. His ego was a monolithic structure built on decades of unchecked power and systemic enabling by everyone around him. He would try to control the narrative because manipulation was his ultimate weapon. I parked in the secured underground garage of my building and took the private elevator up to my penthouse. My home was a direct reflection of my mind. It featured clean architectural lines, minimalist furnishings, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. It was completely devoid of the suffocating heavy mahogany furniture and velvet drapes that defined my parents' massive estate in Sandy Springs. Before I could even drop my keys on the kitchen counter, my phone began vibrating violently against the cool marble surface. I glanced down at the screen. The notifications were rolling in rapidly, lighting up the display like a slot machine paying out a jackpot. I had 32 missed calls and over 50 text messages in the span of 30 minutes. Warren was cycling frantically between pure rage and desperate denial. His first text declared that I was a pathological liar, a disgrace to the sterling name, and that he would bury me in defamation lawsuits before the week was over. His second text demanded I return to the corporate office immediately to explain my threats like a rational adult. Then came the messages from my mother, Vivian. Her texts were an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation. She wrote that my father was experiencing severe chest pains because of my cruel behavior. She begged me to answer the phone so we could sit down and fix this crisis as a family, invoking the church and my supposed duty as a daughter. I did not block their numbers. Blocking them would imply that I was hiding or that their panic affected me. I let the phone rattle incessantly on the counter while I walked down the hall into my home office. I sat down at my desk and woke up my custom multi-monitor setup. I bypassed the standard security protocols and logged directly into my encrypted servers. I needed to move with absolute precision. Warren would inevitably contact the IT department to freeze my access to the company mainframe, completely unaware that I had already built an undetectable backdoor into his personal financial architecture 18 months ago. I opened the master directories, initiated a secure transfer protocol, and began migrating every hidden ledger, every offshore bank statement, and every illicit transaction onto a military-grade biometric burner drive. As the bright green progress bar slowly inched across my screen, the rhythmic hum of my computer tower pulled my mind back to last Thanksgiving. The entire family had gathered at my parents' sprawling mansion. It was their usual performative display of black wealth. They had hired private caterers, valet parking for the guests, and arranged everything perfectly for the photos Vivian loved to post online to maintain their flawless societal image. Connor had been holding court in the center of the formal living room, casually swirling a glass of my grandfather extremely rare bourbon. Connor was a man who possessed all the unearned confidence of his privileged background, completely oblivious to the fact that he was merely a guest in our world, feeding off a legacy he had no hand in building. I remembered sitting quietly on the velvet sofa, nursing a glass of sparkling water, when Connor turned his attention to me. He looked me up and down, taking in my understated tailored suit, and let out a condescending laugh. He announced to the room that it was a real shame I chose to live such a budget lifestyle. He joked that if I ever wanted to learn how to generate real substantial wealth instead of just tracking pennies for other people, I should come shadow him at his investment firm. My sister Jada had giggled, resting her head on his shoulder, completely validated by his arrogance. She chimed in, telling me I needed to loosen up and stop acting like a glorified auditor at family events. My father had simply nodded approvingly from his leather armchair, implicitly endorsing the disrespect while sipping his own drink. What none of them knew on that Thanksgiving day was that while Connor was lecturing me about generating wealth, I was sitting right there holding my phone under the table, actively tracing the IP addresses of his fraudulent shell companies. I was looking at real-time data, showing him funneling millions of dollars directly from Jada Personal Trust Fund into a catastrophic crypto startup that was tanking by the hour. I had smiled at him that day. I had politely thanked him for his unsolicited financial advice, knowing full well that his entire luxurious existence was built on a foundation of theft. I knew I could demolish his life with a single keystroke, but I waited. A forensic accountant knows that the longer you let a thief operate under surveillance, the more rope they give themselves to hang with. The harsh, secure ringing of my private line pulled me back to the present moment. The progress bar on my screen hit 100%, and the transfer complete notification flashed brightly. I picked up the receiver. It was Desmond. His voice was breathless, entirely lacking his usual composed legal cadence. He told me that the boardroom had descended into absolute chaos the second the heavy oak doors closed behind me. But he warned me that Warren was already pivoting, moving aggressively to secure the optics before the rumor mill could start turning. Desmond explained that Warren had just authorized a mass text to the entire board of directors, key company investors, and the upper echelon of Atlanta society. My father was hosting a massive victory dinner tonight at the exclusive Buckhead Country Club. The lavish event had been planned and paid for weeks in advance to celebrate what Warren assumed would be the seamless transition of the Sterling estate into his complete, undisputed control. Now, however, he was repurposing the dinner for a much darker agenda. Desmond told me that Warren intended to use the public forum to announce his hostile takeover of the company. My father planned to stand in front of the city elite and paint me as a disgruntled, mentally unstable daughter who had suffered a psychological break and had to be forcefully removed from the business for the safety of the shareholders. He was going to officially and publicly ice me out of the family legacy, destroying my professional reputation in front of the exact people I needed to respect me. Desmond pleaded with me to stay inside my penthouse. He begged me to turn off my phone, let him file protective injunctions on Monday morning, and avoid a public spectacle that could irreversibly damage my standing in the financial sector. I listened to his frantic, risk-averse legal advice, feeling a slow, cold smile spread across my face. My father wanted a spectacle. He wanted to use the Buckhead Country Club, the very epicenter of their social power and vanity, to humiliate me into submission. He was handing me exactly what I needed to finish this. He was giving me a stage. I told Desmond to stop panicking and take a breath. I ended the call and walked out of my office, making my way into my expansive walk-in closet. I bypassed the conservative business suits, the gray blazers, and the neutral tones I usually wore to blend into the corporate background. Tonight was not about blending in. Tonight was about an execution. I reached into the very back of the closet and pulled out a custom emerald green gown. It was a masterpiece of heavy silk and sharp structure, a dress that radiated unapologetic wealth and absolute undeniable power. It was the color of money, the color of envy, and the color of the empire I was about to rightfully claim. I dressed methodically, treating the preparation like a soldier putting on armor. I applied my makeup with sharp, precise lines. I slipped on a pair of black stiletto heels that echoed sharply against the hardwood floor as I walked back into my office. I ejected the encrypted biometric drive from the secure server and dropped the small metal device into my designer clutch. I picked up my phone, dialing Desmond back. He answered on the first ring, his breathing still heavy-sounding, terrified about what Warren might do next. I did not give him a chance to voice his concerns. I gave him a direct, non-negotiable technical order. I told Desmond to leave the corporate office immediately, get to the country club an hour early, and bribe whoever he needed to bribe on the hospitality staff. I needed him to ensure that the main digital projector in the grand dining hall was synced directly to the open wireless network without any administrative firewalls blocking the connection. Desmond paused, his voice trembling with a mix of utter dread and sharp anticipation as he asked me what I was planning to do. I adjusted the emerald silk of my gown, looking at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window against the beautiful backdrop of the Atlanta skyline. I am going to a party. The valet took the keys to my car outside the Buckhead Country Club without a single word. The heavy mahogany double doors swung open, and the scent of white lilies mixed with expensive champagne hit me instantly. This was the absolute epicenter of Atlanta high society. The ballroom was packed with the city's most influential power players, politicians, venture capitalists, and logistics magnates. At the front of the room stood a massive elevated stage flanked by two towering digital screens. Both screens proudly displayed the Sterling Logistics crest in glowing gold. My father stood at the podium right in the middle of a grandiose toast. His voice boomed through the microphone, dripping with unearned confidence as he talked about honoring my grandfather and his legendary vision. He spoke eloquently about securing the future, telling the crowd about how he and Connor were going to take the Sterling Empire to unprecedented global heights. It was a flawless, rehearsed performance perfectly designed to reassure the investors that the company was in safe and capable hands. I stepped into the ballroom, the heavy emerald silk of my custom gown moving fluidly with every step. My stilettos clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The crowd closest to the doors turned their murmurs rippling forward like a wave of sudden electricity. I did not stop. I did not look left or right. I kept my eyes locked on the head table positioned directly below the stage. There was one empty chair at the very end of the velvet-roped reserved section, likely left open simply to balance the floral arrangements. I walked right past the stunned faces of corporate vice presidents and wealthy socialites, pulled out the chair and sat down. Warren stopped speaking mid-sentence. The microphone let out a sharp, unpleasant whine of acoustic feedback. The entire room went dead silent. The color drained from my father's face, quickly replaced by a furious, mottled purple. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. He glared at me, his chest heaving, before turning his attention to the two security guards standing near the kitchen exit. He pointed a shaking finger in my direction and ordered them to remove the trespasser immediately. He grabbed the microphone again, his voice tight with manufactured sympathy. He announced to the packed ballroom that he sincerely apologized for the interruption, claiming his estranged, unstable daughter was experiencing a severe mental health crisis and had absolutely no business being on the premises. Beside me at the head table, Jada leaned over toward the mayor wife, covering her mouth but speaking loudly enough for the surrounding investors to hear. Jada shook her head, putting on her best performance of the deeply concerned sister. She whispered that I was just bitterly acting out because I could not cut it in the corporate world. She spun a quick, vicious lie right there, claiming I had suffered a psychological breakdown last year because I lacked the stamina to handle real money and real corporate pressure. She painted herself as the stable, successful daughter who had married well and stayed loyal to the family. Connor sat next to Jada, adjusting his designer tie, looking down his nose at me with a smirk that practically screamed he had already won. He actually motioned for the security guards to hurry up and grab me. The guards approached the table, but they hesitated. They knew exactly who I was. I was a Sterling, and I was sitting with a posture so relaxed and authoritative that it completely contradicted my father's false narrative of mental instability. I did not raise my voice. I did not break a sweat. I smoothly opened my designer clutch and pulled out my phone. Desmond had done exactly what I asked. He had bypassed the club firewall and linked my encrypted drive directly to the central audiovisual system. I looked up at Warren, who was now demanding that the technical team cut the stage lights. I simply tapped a single button on my screen. The giant digital displays behind the podium flickered wildly. The golden Sterling Logistics crest vanished instantly. In its place, a massive, brilliantly illuminated document appeared on both screens for the entire ballroom of investors and politicians to see. It was a heavily redacted bank statement from a secure offshore trust. The account holder name was displayed in bold black letters right at the top: Aaliyah Sterling. Below it, the verified account balance glowed with unmistakable clarity: $40 million. The collective gasp from the room was intensely cinematic. Chairs scraped loudly against the marble floor as investors leaned forward, pulling out their reading glasses to stare at the massive screens. Warren turned around, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he processed the numbers displayed behind him. He looked back at me, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. The routing numbers and the official bank seals proved the document was flawless. The illusion of his total control was shattering in real time right in front of the very people he desperately needed to impress to keep the company afloat. I stood up from my chair. The acoustics in the grand dining hall were perfect, carrying my voice clearly across the silent room without any need for a microphone. I looked directly at my father. "That check you burned this morning, Dad," I said, making sure every syllable landed with lethal precision. "It was a decoy. Grandpa Elias knew exactly how predictable your ego was. He wired the actual $40 million into an ironclad offshore trust for me 3 years ago. You do not have the capital to run this company. You are completely broke." I let the harsh reality of his financial ruin sink into the room before I pivoted my gaze down the table. I locked eyes with my brother-in-law, watching the smug satisfaction melt right off his face and turn into pure, unadulterated panic. And Connor. I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady calm. Since we are sharing financial updates with our investors tonight, you might want to explain to Jada why you have been funneling her entire personal trust fund into a failing crypto startup. The sharp crack of crystal hitting marble echoed through the grand dining hall. Jada had dropped her champagne flute. The expensive liquid splashed across the polished floor, but nobody looked down. Every single pair of eyes in the Buckhead Country Club was locked on Connor. Jada turned to her husband, her flawless facade cracking as her manicured hands grasped the lapels of his tuxedo. She demanded to know what I was talking about. Her voice was shrill, completely devoid of its usual arrogant lilt. Connor stammered. The confident, condescending finance bro who had mocked my lifestyle just moments before was suddenly sweating profusely. A dark stain spread across his collar. He looked at the massive digital screens displaying my financial independence, then looked at the crowd of investors glaring at him. He tried to puff out his chest, pointing a shaking finger at me. He shouted that I was insane. He told the room not to listen to a lying, jealous spinster who was just bitter because no man would ever want her. He claimed I had fabricated the entire story to destroy his marriage because I was miserable and alone. I did not yell. I did not need to. I stood up, smoothing the emerald silk of my gown, and walked slowly down the length of the head table. The room was so quiet you could hear the rustle of my dress. I began to walk the room through the math. I told them that numbers never lie, and they certainly do not harbor jealousy. I started dropping the exact details, letting the cold, hard facts suffocate his pathetic insults. I looked directly at the mayor and the lead investors sitting in the front row. I told them to look into a shell company called Blue Ridge Ventures. I recited the exact routing numbers from memory. I detailed how on October 14th, Connor executed a wire transfer of $2.4 million from Jada Personal Trust directly into a decentralized crypto exchange. When that market tanked in early November, he panicked. He needed liquid capital to cover his massive margin calls, but the trust was empty. I stopped pacing and stood right behind Connor's chair. I placed my hands on the back of it, leaning in close so my voice projected perfectly. I told the room that Connor did not stop at stealing his wife's inheritance. I revealed that on November 22nd, he accessed the Sterling Logistics operational budget. He falsified vendor invoices for a phantom shipping fleet in the Midwest and siphoned another $3 million straight out of the company treasury. He bled the Sterling legacy dry to pay for his own incompetence. Jada let out a piercing scream. It was not a scream of heartbreak over her husband's betrayal. It was the terrified shriek of a woman realizing her limitless credit cards were about to bounce. She lunged toward me, her face contorted with rage. She screamed that I was an evil, spiteful woman trying to ruin her perfect life. She accused me of fabricating the audit because I had always hated her because I was obsessed with tearing down everything she had built. She yelled that I was a monster for trying to destroy her reputation in front of Atlanta high society. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until we were inches apart. I looked down into her panicked eyes. I told her I did not need to ruin her life because her husband had already done it for me. I reminded her that my memory is just as sharp as my accounting skills. I lowered my voice just a fraction, making sure the people at the surrounding tables could still hear every word. I asked her if she remembered the summer she was 19. The summer she took our father's luxury sedan out after drinking at a college party and slammed it into a parked car. I watched the blood drain from Jada's face as I dragged her darkest secret into the light. I reminded her how our parents dragged me out of bed in the middle of the night. They forced me to get behind the wheel of that wrecked car and take the blame when the police arrived. I took the criminal charge. I paid the fines. I let my own record take the hit so she would not lose her acceptance to Spelman College, and her pristine debutante image would remain completely spotless. I looked my sister dead in the eye and told her I paid for her perfection once. Never again. Jada stumbled backward, gasping for air as the whispers in the ballroom erupted into a deafening roar. The investors were furious. They were pulling out their phones, dialing their legal teams, demanding immediate freezes on all Sterling Logistics assets. The socialites who had just been toasting to my family legacy were now staring at Jada and Connor with absolute disgust. The immaculate sterling reputation was disintegrating right before their eyes. Connor was completely backed into a corner. He looked frantically around the room, realizing that the powerful people he had spent years kissing up to were now looking at him like he was a criminal bound for federal prison. He looked at Jada, who had backed away from him in horror. He realized he was being served up on a silver platter as the sole scapegoat for the entire financial collapse of the company. The pressure was too much. The walls were closing in and the cowardly finance bro finally snapped. Connor scrambled out of his chair, knocking his wine glass onto the floor. He spun around, pointing a shaking, desperate finger directly at my father, who was still standing frozen at the podium. Connor's voice cracked as he screamed over the noise of the crowd. He yelled that he did not do it alone. He screamed that Warren knew about the missing money all along. Connor confessed right then and there that Warren authorized every single one of those transfers to cover up his own declining profit margins. The pristine silence of the Buckhead Country Club shattered into a million jagged pieces. The moment Connor screamed that my father authorized the fraudulent transfers, the entire room erupted into chaos. Decades of carefully manicured social standing evaporated in a matter of seconds. I watched the mayor's wife literally drop her linen napkin and aggressively signal her private security detail to escort her out the side door. The lead investors, the men and women who had just raised their champagne glasses to toast my father. Visionary leadership did not even bother to hide their absolute panic. They whipped out their phones right at the dinner tables, knocking over expensive silverware. The glow of screens illuminated their furious faces as they frantically texted their brokers, demanding an immediate freeze on all Sterling Logistics assets before the market opened on Monday morning. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one, and my father was the captain holding the drill. Warren Sterling, the man who demanded absolute perfection from everyone around him, completely lost his mind. His pristine tuxedo jacket stretched tight across his broad shoulders as he lunged across the space separating him from his son-in-law. He grabbed Connor by the collar of his custom-tailored shirt, hauling the younger man up onto his toes. The expensive crystal centerpieces rattled violently as Connor crashed backward into the heavy mahogany head table, sending plates of untouched caviar crashing to the floor. My father's face was a mask of unhinged rage. He screamed at Connor to shut his mouth, calling him a pathetic liar and a worthless parasite. The picture-perfect image of Atlanta premier black elite family dissolved into a brutal physical brawl right next to the ice sculpture. Waiters backed away in shock, dropping silver trays. Security guards rushed forward but hesitated, unsure if they should put their hands on the billionaire paying their salaries or let the two criminals destroy each other. I stood amidst the absolute destruction, completely untouched. I did not step back to avoid the flying glass. I did not flinch when Connor knocked over a towering floral arrangement that sent water pooling around my designer heels. I let the manic energy of the room wash over me while I calmly smoothed the silk of my emerald gown. Warren shoved Connor aside, letting the finance bro stumble and fall hard against the cold marble floor. My father turned his furious gaze toward me, breathing heavily like a cornered animal. He frantically tried to backtrack, his authority crumbling in real time. He pointed at me, shouting to the remaining crowd that this was an elaborate setup. He claimed I had manipulated the financial records to frame him because I was bitter about being passed over for the chief executive position. He tried to project his usual booming power to command the room, but his voice cracked under the weight of his own lies. Without his money shielding him, he looked incredibly small. I stepped around the broken crystal and spilled champagne, moving with deliberate purpose. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him, invading his personal space. You let a mediocre fraudster steal from Grandpa Elias' legacy just to hide your own incompetence. My voice did not echo like his did. It carried a quiet, lethal authority that forced the surrounding investors to lean in and listen to every single word. I broke down his failure right to his face, refusing to let him hide behind his booming voice. I told him I knew his profit margins had been shrinking for 5 straight quarters because he was too arrogant to adapt to modern supply chain demands. I knew he lost the major regional shipping contract because he refused to upgrade the fleet Grandpa Elias built with his own 2 hands. Instead of doing the hard work to save the company, he let his arrogant son-in-law drain Jada Trust Fund and the corporate treasury to artificially inflate the quarterly earnings reports. You burned down the house your father built just so you could pretend you were keeping us warm. Warren's chest heaved as he stared at me. He realized the investors were listening to my forensic breakdown, and they were believing every single word because the math was indisputable. Vivian. My mother finally broke her paralyzed silence. She rushed forward, grabbing my father's arm with perfectly manicured hands that were now trembling violently. She hissed at him that they needed to leave immediately before the press caught wind of the physical altercation and ruined their pristine church reputation. Jada was already sobbing uncontrollably on the floor next to Connor, mourning the sudden violent death of her unlimited credit limit. She slapped Connor's hands away when he tried to comfort her, finally realizing that her white knight was actually the architect of her financial ruin. Her perfect debutante facade was completely wrecked. Warren yanked his arm away from my mother, but he knew she was right. The room was turning hostile. Investors were actively shouting demands for their money back. He barked an order at Jada, telling her to get up off the floor and get to the car. He looked back at me, his eyes narrowing with a familiar vindictive hatred. He straightened his ruined tuxedo jacket, desperately trying to salvage whatever shred of dignity he had left in front of the Atlanta elite. He told me I had made a massive miscalculation. He promised to bury me in litigation until I had nothing left. He sneered that he had the best corporate defense lawyers in the South on retainer, ready to destroy my life. He threatened to tie up my $40 million trust fund in civil court for the next 2 decades, making sure I spent every dime I had defending myself against malicious defamation suits. He told me I would be begging to come back to the family when the legal fees bankrupted me and left me homeless on the streets of the city my grandfather helped build. I listened to his desperate threats with mild amusement. He was still playing checkers while I was executing the final moves of a chess match he did not even know we had started. I calmly picked up my designer clutch from the table. I snapped the gold clasp shut, sealing the moment permanently. I looked at my father with a smile that carried years of delayed justice and silent endurance. "You cannot afford them anymore, Dad." Warren froze halfway through his dramatic exit. He turned back, his expression shifting rapidly from blinding rage to genuine confusion. I tilted my head, savoring the absolute destruction of his ego. I reminded him about his little theatrical performance in the boardroom that morning. "Because the IRS just received the unredacted version of the non-disclosure agreement you burned this morning." I watched his jaw physically drop as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. I told him the Financial Crimes Division was currently freezing his personal offshore accounts and the corporate treasury. His high-priced lawyers demanded hefty retainers up front. Retainers he could no longer pay because his bank accounts currently held a balance of exactly zero. I watched the venom drip from my mother's lips, absorbing every hateful word without letting a single muscle in my face flinch. She stood there, breathing heavily, convinced she had just delivered the ultimate killing blow to my confidence. She expected me to shrink, to cry, to revert to the little girl who used to beg for her affection. Instead, I slowly reached into the bottom drawer of my desk. I did not pull out a tissue. I did not pull out a counteroffer. I pulled out a worn, heavy leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and faded from years of use. I placed it gently on the center of my glass desk. Vivian's gaze darted down to the object. I watched the realization hit her like a freight train. Her eyes widened, and the arrogant sneer on her face completely dissolved into stark, naked terror. It was Grandpa Elias's personal journal. I flipped the heavy pages until I reached a section marked by a thin red ribbon. I turned the book around and slid it toward her. I told her that she was right about one thing. In the eyes of the Atlanta elite, a bitter daughter's word might not carry much weight against the pillars of the community. But the handwritten, meticulously detailed confessions of the founding patriarch definitely would. I watched her eyes scan the page. The journal did not just detail Warren's gambling debts from a decade ago. It detailed her exact involvement. I read the passage aloud to her, quoting my grandfather's precise, sharp handwriting. It outlined how Vivian Sterling, acting as the corporate secretary, actively helped Warren forge Grandpa Elias's signature on early real estate deeds, to cover up the massive financial holes Warren had blown in the company treasury. She was not a passive bystander playing the loyal wife. She was a co-conspirator who had actively committed felony fraud to maintain her own lavish lifestyle. Vivian went deathly pale. She reached out her hands, shaking violently, trying to snatch the journal away from me. I pulled it back swiftly, securing it safely out of her reach. She stumbled back into the guest chair, stammering that the journal was a fake. She claimed it was inadmissible hearsay and that she would tell the world I forged it myself just to steal the company. She shouted that a dead man's diary could not put her in prison. I looked at the phone sitting face up on the corner of my desk. It had been there the entire time she was in my office. The screen was dark, but a tiny red light blinked steadily at the top. I smiled a genuine cold smile. "It might be hearsay, Mom," I said softly. "But the confession you just made about me having no real proof against your father, while explicitly trying to bribe me with $5 million in company funds, that is recorded. And it is already uploaded to a secure cloud server that you cannot touch." I watched the venom drip from my mother's lips. She stood perfectly upright in her tailored cream suit, breathing heavily, entirely convinced she had just delivered the ultimate killing blow to my confidence. She expected me to shrink. She expected me to lower my gaze, to revert to the little girl who used to beg for her affection and validation. Instead, I maintained absolute eye contact. I did not blink. I did not offer a counterproposal. I simply let her malicious words hang in the sterile air-conditioned atmosphere of my office. I slowly reached down toward the reinforced bottom drawer of my desk. I pressed my thumb against the biometric lock. The quiet, mechanical click made her pause. I did not pull out a tissue to dry non-existent tears. I did not pull out a drafted settlement agreement to surrender my leverage. I pulled out a worn, heavy leather-bound book. The cover was cracked along the spine, faded from years of meticulous use, and smelled faintly of the premium cigars Grandpa Elias used to smoke on his veranda. I placed it gently on the exact center of my glass desk. Vivian's gaze darted down to the object. I watched the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her eyes widened, and the arrogant, untouchable sneer on her face completely dissolved into stark, naked terror. She recognized the embossed gold initials on the bottom right corner of the cover. It was Grandpa Elias' personal private journal. I reached out and slowly flipped the heavy pages until I reached a section marked by a thin red silk ribbon. I turned the book around and slid it across the smooth glass surface toward her. I kept my voice incredibly calm, treating the moment like a routine audit readout for a corporate client. I told her she was absolutely right about one thing. In the eyes of the Atlanta elite, a bitter daughter word might not carry much weight against the pillars of the community. But the handwritten, meticulously detailed confessions of the founding patriarch definitely would. I watched her eyes frantically scan the page. The journal did not just detail Warren underground gambling debts from a decade ago. It detailed her exact calculated involvement. I decided to read the passage aloud to her, quoting my grandfather, precise, sharp handwriting, so she could not look away from her own sins. I read the entry dated October 14, 2014. I read how Grandpa Elias discovered a massive $4.2 million hole in the corporate treasury. He traced it back to an illegal gambling syndicate Warren had gotten tangled up with during a supposedly routine logistics conference in Las Vegas. But the most damning part was not Warren weakness. It was Vivian complicity. I read aloud how Vivian Sterling, acting as the corporate secretary for Sterling Logistics, actively helped Warren forge Grandpa Elias' signature on 3 early real estate deeds. They transferred the ownership of our prime West End distribution centers to a holding company controlled by the syndicate to cover the spread and prevent the destruction of the family image. She was not a passive bystander playing the loyal, oblivious wife. She used her official notary stamp to legitimize a felony. She was a co-conspirator who had actively committed corporate fraud to maintain her own lavish lifestyle and protect her country club status. I leaned back in my executive chair, folding my hands together. I reminded her of the summer of 2015, right after those deeds were fraudulently transferred. I reminded her how she had lectured me for hours in the formal living room because I wanted to take a summer internship at a rival accounting firm instead of working for the family business. She had stood in front of the marble fireplace, sipping her sweet tea, lecturing me about integrity, familial loyalty, and upholding the flawless Sterling name, all while she knew she had secretly signed away the very foundation of my grandfather empire. Vivian went deathly pale. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her expensive makeup looking like a harsh, unnatural mask. She reached out with both hands, her manicured nails scraping loudly against the glass desk, frantically trying to snatch the journal away from me. I was faster. I pulled the heavy book back swiftly, securing it safely out of her reach and dropping it into my open briefcase beside my chair. She stumbled back into the guest chair, hyperventilating. Her chest heaved as she desperately tried to piece her shattered facade back together. When the initial shock subsided, the sheer survival instinct of a cornered predator took over. She sat up straight, smoothing the wrinkles out of her cream skirt, and her face hardened into a mask of pure defiance. She pointed a shaking finger at me and stammered that the journal was a complete fake. She claimed it was inadmissible hearsay in any court of law. She raised her voice, threatening to tell the entire world that I had forged the diary myself, just to steal the company out of sheer jealousy. She told me a dead man diary could not put her in a federal prison. I calmly explained to her that a diary alone is just paper and ink, but I am a forensic accountant. I told her I took Grandpa Elias' journal entries and cross-referenced them with the Fulton County property records from that exact week in October. I pulled the original transfer documents from the county archives. I found her notary stamp on the fraudulent paperwork. I tracked the holding company that received our warehouses and followed the corporate shell structure straight back to the gambling syndicate Warren owed money to. I had a paper trail that completely corroborated every single word written in that leather-bound book. She refused to back down. She began to pace in front of my desk, gaining momentum as she spun her web of lies. She described exactly how she would destroy me. She threatened to leverage her entire high society network. She said she would call the board members of her charity foundations, her prominent sorority sisters, and the influential wives of the city council. She threatened to host a tearful press conference on the steps of our family church. She promised to paint me as a psychotic, deeply disturbed daughter who had suffered a mental breakdown and fabricated a delusional conspiracy to ruin her own loving parents. She painted a vivid, terrifying picture of how the Atlanta elite would immediately rally behind her, the devoted and long-suffering wife, and cast me as the ultimate villain. She told me I would be blacklisted from every major financial firm in the country by the time she was done with me. I let her rant. I let her exhaust every single threat in her arsenal. A good forensic auditor knows that you never interrupt a suspect while they are busy digging their own grave. I realized in that moment that the woman standing in front of me had never been a mother to me. She was just a business partner to my father, and I was merely a liability on their balance sheet. That realization did not break my heart. It set me completely free. When she finally ran out of breath, she stood at the edge of my desk, glaring down at me with a triumphant, malicious gleam in her eye. She truly believed she had won. I did not argue with her legal assessment. I did not defend my grandfather's handwriting. Instead, I slowly shifted my gaze to the cell phone sitting face up on the corner of my desk. It had been resting there the entire time she was in my office. The screen was completely dark, but a tiny green light blinked steadily at the top edge of the device. I smiled, offering her a genuine cold smile that mirrored the absolute finality of her situation. I tapped the dark screen of my phone once, bringing the display to life. A high-definition audio recording application was running, the sound waves spiking rhythmically with the ambient noise in the room. I looked up at my mother, watching the triumphant gleam in her eye instantly shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. "It might be hearsay, Mom," I said softly, making sure every syllable landed with devastating clarity, "but the confession you just made about me having no real proof against your father, while explicitly trying to bribe me with $5 million in stolen corporate funds to sign a gag order. And the part where you just threatened to run a coordinated smear campaign to cover up felony forgery, that is all recorded in pristine high-definition audio." I picked up the phone, tapped the screen one final time to end the recording, and set the device back down. I informed her that the file was not just saved on local storage. It was already automatically uploaded to a secure encrypted cloud server managed by my legal team. A server that she, Warren, and their highly paid defense attorneys could never touch, alter, or delete. I watched the last shred of color leave her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice completely failed her. The sweet negotiating mother was gone. The vicious threatening socialite was gone. All that remained was a terrified accomplice realizing she had just handed the executioner the very weapon needed to end her reign. 48 hours had passed since I locked my mother in a prison of her own making inside my office. 2 days of absolute suffocating silence from my parents' sprawling estate in Sandy Springs. But a seasoned forensic accountant knows that silence from a cornered fraudster is never a surrender. It is merely the sound of them reloading their weapons. Warren and Connor had spent the last 48 hours scrambling like desperate rats trapped in the hull of a rapidly sinking ship. They pulled every single string they had left in Atlanta, cashed in every remaining political favor, and abused their executive power to completely bypass standard corporate governance protocols. They called a mandatory, heavily expedited emergency shareholder meeting. I knew exactly what they were planning before the official corporate notices were even drafted and sent out to the board. They intended to invoke an archaic, highly subjective morality clause buried deep in the original founding charter of Sterling Logistics. It was a technical loophole designed decades ago to protect the company from public scandal and reputational ruin. Warren was going to weaponize the disastrous confrontation at the country club against me. He planned to frame my exposure of his and Connor financial crimes as a malicious, unprovoked public attack on the corporate brand itself. His ultimate goal was to force an emergency board vote to instantly dilute the remaining shares Grandpa Elias had left me in his will. They were trying to legally lock me out of the company forever, erecting an impenetrable corporate firewall before the Internal Revenue Service could fully process the unredacted documents and freeze their assets. They thought they could move faster than the federal government. They thought they could outmaneuver me in the one specific arena they believed they still controlled. I arrived at the Sterling Logistics downtown headquarters precisely 10 minutes after the meeting was scheduled to begin. I did not want to be early. I wanted them to feel secure. I wanted my father to stand at the head of that massive glass table and build a false, fragile sense of victory. I stepped out of my car wearing a tailored charcoal suit that projected pure, unadulterated authority. I walked into the grand lobby, completely ignoring the panicked stares of the reception staff who had clearly been given strict instructions not to let me pass the security gates. But they did not dare step in my way or reach for their radios. Because I did not walk into that building alone. I was flanked by 3 of the most ruthless predatory corporate acquisition lawyers in the state of Georgia. These were not the standard compliant corporate counsel. My father kept on retainer to rubber stamp his terrible business decisions. These were apex predators of the financial district. Men and women who dismantled Fortune 500 companies for sport, who orchestrated hostile takeovers before they even finished their morning coffee. Their presence alone was a massive declaration of war. We bypassed the security desk, rode the private executive elevator in absolute silence, and stepped out onto the top floor of the tower. I stood outside the heavy frosted glass doors of the primary boardroom. I could hear my father's booming voice echoing down the corridor. He was mid-sentence delivering the performance of a lifetime to the assembled board members. These were the most powerful logistics magnates in the South, a tight circle of old money billionaires who had profited alongside my father for decades. Warren was currently painting me as a corporate terrorist. I listened as he told the room that I had suffered a complete and total mental collapse. He claimed with feigned paternal sorrow that the grueling nature of my career had finally broken my sanity, leading me to launch a coordinated, completely baseless attack against my own family just to sabotage the company's stock price. He was literally asking them for a unified, immediate vote to strip me of my inheritance in order to protect their massive financial investments. I pushed the heavy double doors open. They hit the magnetic stoppers with a resonant, booming thud that instantly cut my father off mid-sentence. The sprawling room went dead silent. The billionaires seated around the massive table turned their high-backed leather chairs in unison to stare at me. The air in the room was thick with tension, and the smell of expensive dark roast coffee. Warren stood at the head of the table beneath a massive oil portrait of Grandpa Elias. His hands were planted firmly on the glass. His face morphed from initial shock into a mask of aggressive, condescending amusement. He actually laughed out loud. It was a harsh, dismissive sound meant to firmly assert his dominance over the room and remind the board who was in charge. He pointed a finger toward the entrance and loudly declared that his estranged, unstable daughter was actively trespassing on private corporate property. He immediately signaled the two private security guards stationed in the far corners of the room, barking strict orders for them to escort me off the premises, using whatever physical force was necessary. He turned back to the board members, throwing his hands up in a gesture of mock exhaustion, reminding them that this pathetic, desperate stunt was exactly why they needed to vote me out today, before I caused any further embarrassment to the Sterling legacy. Connor stood right beside my father, his arrogant smirk returning now that he was surrounded by wealthy, powerful men he believed would automatically protect him. He adjusted his designer tie and sneered at me, clearly thinking the physical presence of the board shielded him from any further consequences of his embezzlement. He muttered loud enough for the room to hear that I was embarrassing myself, and that I needed to be escorted to a psychiatric facility before I did any more damage to the company reputation. Warren looked at my formidable legal team, his eyes narrowing, then looked directly at me. He leaned over the table, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. He decided to mock my financial standing right in front of the city elite. He told me that a $40 million trust fund might seem like a massive fortune to a glorified number cruncher, but it was absolute pocket change in a room like this. He sneered that my little stockpile of cash was completely insufficient to buy out a board comprised of billionaire logistics magnates. He guaranteed me that every single man seated at that table was going to vote to dilute my shares, drain my equity, and erase my name from the Sterling Empire permanently. He told me I was outgunned, outmatched, and entirely out of my league. The security guards took a tentative step forward to carry out his orders, but my lead attorney simply raised a single hand. The gesture carried such an overwhelming aura of legal menace that the guards froze instantly in their tracks, completely unwilling to risk a massive personal lawsuit for laying a hand on me. I did not break eye contact with my father. I walked calmly past the paralyzed guards, past the stunned billionaires, and made my way down the length of the room to the exact opposite end of the massive table. I pulled out the heavy leather chair positioned directly facing my father. I sat down perfectly poised, smoothing the lines of my charcoal suit. I folded my hands deliberately on the polished glass surface. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice steady, cold, and completely void of fear. I told him I did not come to buy them out, Dad. I came to collect. My lead attorney unclasps his brushed leather briefcase and retrieves 5 thick matte black dossiers. I do not look at my father or his panicked son-in-law. I look directly at the 5 men who hold the fate of Sterling Logistics in their manicured hands. These are the titans of Atlanta high society. These are men who built their fortunes alongside my grandfather, but allowed their integrity to rot the moment my father took over. I take the heavy folders from my attorney and slide one across the polished glass table to each board member. The sound of the thick cardstock gliding over the glass is the only noise in the sprawling room. I tell them to open the files. Over the last 48 hours, while Warren and Connor were busy drafting morality clauses to steal my shares, I was busy executing a completely different strategy. I used my $40 million trust not to buy company stock, but to purchase the toxic, highly leveraged personal debts of every single man sitting at this table. Through a network of forensic accounting contacts and discreet shell companies, I bought their commercial mortgages, their private equity loans, and the margin calls they had been desperately trying to keep hidden from the public eye. I became their primary creditor overnight. I turned my attention to Calvin Davis, the most senior board member, and my father's oldest fraternity brother. His hands are trembling so violently, he can barely flip open the cover of his folder. I look right at him and ask if he remembers the summer of 2018. I remind him how my father forced me to work unpaid weekends auditing the company, so-called charity accounts. Warren told me it was my duty to the family to make sure the books balanced. But I knew the truth. I was there to clean up their messes. I tell Calvin that I saw the discrepancies back then. I saw the massive offshore real estate losses he tried to bury under a shell corporation in the Bahamas. I kept those records safely encrypted for years. And yesterday afternoon, I bought the entire defaulted loan portfolio he used to keep his sprawling Buckhead mansion from going into foreclosure. Calvin looks like all the oxygen has been violently sucked out of his lungs. The other board members are frantically tearing open their dossiers and finding the exact same terrifying reality. They are staring at printouts of their own financial ruin. Debts they thought were buried under layers of corporate obfuscation are now sitting right in front of them, neatly highlighted and legally binding. I own the paper on their luxury cars, their vacation homes, and their failing side businesses. I stand up slowly, placing both hands flat on the glass table and lean forward. I keep my voice completely steady, projecting absolute, unshakable authority. I command them to look at my father. I tell them that they owe Warren favors because he let them get rich off my grandfather legacy while looking the other way when they skimmed from the top. But I tell them they owe me their freedom. I let the reality of the ultimatum settle heavily over the boardroom. You vote with him today to dilute my shares, and I will call in every single one of your debts before the banks close at 5. I will bankrupt your personal estates, seize your assets, and hand your financial crimes over to the federal authorities. My voice does not waver. But if you vote with me, we restructure your debts, and we save this company from the two men actively driving it into the ground. Connor lets out a strangled noise from the corner of the room. He looks at Warren, his face completely drained of blood, realizing that his arrogant display of white privilege and unearned power has just collided with a wall of undeniable financial leverage. He tries to whisper something to my father, but Warren violently shoves him away. Warren is losing his grip on reality. The veins in his neck are bulging and his face is twisted into a mask of pure desperation. He slams both of his fists onto the glass table, screaming at the board secretary to record the official motion immediately. He demands a binding vote to invoke the morality clause and strip my familial voting rights permanently. He yells at Calvin and the other men, invoking decades of brotherhood and country club loyalty. He screams at them to raise their hands and end this madness right now so they can have me escorted out by security and thrown into a psychiatric ward. The room becomes suffocatingly quiet. The air conditioning hums softly in the background. The board members look down at their damning financial dossiers. They see the exact dollar amounts that will ruin their lives and their pristine societal reputations. Then they look up at me, standing flanked by corporate lawyers who are ready to file the bankruptcy papers at a moment's notice. Calvin Davis swallows hard. He closes his black folder and pushes it slightly away from him. He looks at my father with an expression of profound apology and pure self-preservation. Then Calvin raises his right hand high into the air to vote against Warren Sterling. One by one, in complete and absolute silence, every single board member around that massive table raises their hand to vote against my father. The motion to strip my shares is unanimously denied. Warren stumbles backward, falling into his high-backed leather executive chair. He looks around the room as if he has just been stabbed in the back by his own army. He cannot comprehend that his money and his booming voice are no longer enough to command obedience. I slowly lower myself back into my chair, smoothing the fabric of my suit. I look directly into my father's horrified eyes, watching his empire crumble into dust. I tell him I do not just have the seat at the table, I own the table. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating. The 5 billionaires sitting around the massive glass table stared at me, completely paralyzed by the realization that their pristine financial reputations were now entirely in my hands. I did not give them a moment to breathe or formulate a counterattack. I turned my attention directly to Patricia, the longtime corporate secretary, who had faithfully recorded the minutes of these executive board meetings for over 2 decades. Her hands were shaking visibly as they hovered over her laptop keyboard. I instructed her to open a new section for the official record. I spoke with total unwavering clarity, ensuring that the legal foundation of my hostile takeover was absolutely airtight. I formally proposed the immediate and permanent termination of Warren Sterling from the position of Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Logistics, effective as of this exact second. I followed that declaration by mandating the immediate initiation of a comprehensive independent criminal audit into Connor Pierce, focusing specifically on his fraudulent management of the corporate treasury and his unauthorized creation of the Midwestern Phantom shipping fleets. I looked back at the 5 powerful men sitting at the table. I did not even have to ask for a formal discussion or a debate on the motion. Calvin Davis raised his hand immediately, his eyes fixed firmly on the black dossier sitting in front of him, fully aware that his offshore real estate failures would bankrupt him by sunset if he defied me. The other 4 board members followed his lead in rapid, terrified succession. It was a unanimous vote. The gavel fell silently, but its impact reverberated through the very foundation of the building. My father was officially fired from the empire my grandfather built. The phrase criminal audit hit Connor like a physical blow to the chest. The arrogant, condescending smirk that he usually wore like a protective uniform was entirely gone. It was replaced by the sheer primal panic of a man who suddenly realized that federal prison was no longer just a hypothetical risk meant for other people. He knew exactly what my forensic accounting team would find when they ripped through his doctored ledgers. They would find the wire fraud. They would find the falsified vendor invoices. They would find the undeniable paper trail leading directly back to his personal offshore accounts. He began to hyperventilate. He backed away from the heavy glass table, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping clumsily against the carpet. He turned on his heels and made a sudden desperate dash for the heavy frosted glass doors at the back of the boardroom. He actually believed he could just walk out of the building, climb into his least luxury sports car, and disappear before the federal authorities arrived. I was severely mistaken. My legal team came fully prepared for the flight response of a cornered, cowardly fraudster. My lead attorney had already signaled the tactical coordination before I even walked into the room. As Connor grabbed the brass handle and pulled the heavy door open, he was met by an impenetrable wall. 2 towering private corporate security contractors, dressed in perfectly tailored black suits, stepped squarely into the threshold. They did not draw weapons. They did not even lay a hand on him. Their sheer physical presence and unwavering stances were more than enough. The taller guard looked down at Connor and informed him that standard corporate protocol for a terminated and criminally audited executive required him to remain on the premises immediately. He was instructed that he could not leave the room until all Corporate Access Badges Company issued cell phones and encrypted laptops were fully surrendered and cataloged for the investigators. Connor stumbled backward, completely trapped in the very room where he thought he was untouchable. In the far corner of the room, my sister Jada was sitting in a plush leather observer chair. She had come here today to play the role of the supportive, oblivious trophy wife, fully expecting to watch our father strip away my inheritance so she could continue funding her lavish lifestyle without a second thought. The brutal reality of the situation finally pierced through her deep, willful delusion. The math finally clicked in her head. Her personal trust fund was empty. Her husband was facing federal indictment. Her father was entirely broke and newly unemployed. She stood up, her designer heels sinking into the thick carpet. She looked at Connor, who was sweating and pacing near the door like a trapped animal, and then she looked directly at me. Jada began to sob, but it was not out of loyalty or heartbreak over her husband impending incarceration. Her tears were born from the pure terror of impending poverty. She screamed at me across the boardroom, her voice shrill and desperate. She demanded to know how she was supposed to pay the contractors for the massive upcoming renovations on her Buckhead mansion. She shrieked loudly about her exclusive country club dues, her upcoming winter trips to St. Bart's, and the fact that her premium credit cards were going to decline by nightfall. I looked at her, feeling absolutely zero pity. I reminded her of the afternoon just 3 months ago when she laughed in my face while sitting by my parents' custom swimming pool. I reminded her that she told me I would never understand true luxury because I was too busy working a boring pedestrian job crunching numbers. I told her that true wealth is not an allowance you beg for from a corrupt father, but the power you build secure and protect with your own two hands. I told her that her glamorous lifestyle evaporated the very minute she let a mediocre, smooth-talking fraudster handle her finances because she was too lazy and too entitled to read her own bank statements. Jada collapsed back into the leather chair. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, as her flawless, expensive makeup ruined her custom silk blouse. The focus of the room violently shifted back to the head of the table. Warren had been sitting frozen in his executive chair, his breathing ragged and incredibly shallow. The absolute realization that he no longer held any power, any title, or any control over the Sterling Empire finally shattered his mind. The carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated, untouchable Atlanta billionaire disintegrated completely. He stood up so violently that his heavy leather executive chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the floor. He grabbed his custom ceramic coffee mug from the table. He hurled it across the room with blinding, explosive rage. The mug smashed violently against the far wall directly beneath the majestic oil portrait of Grandpa Elias. Dark coffee and sharp, jagged ceramic shards rained down onto the plush carpet. The billionaire board members flinched instinctively, pressing themselves back into their seats to avoid the flying debris. Warren did not care about the optics anymore. The mask was off. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at me. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing against his starched white collar. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing fiercely off the mahogany panels. He yelled that he built this empire with his own blood and sweat. He claimed that he sacrificed his entire life to keep the Sterling name at the absolute top of the Southern logistics industry, completely and deliberately, erasing the decades of grueling foundation work my grandfather actually did to build the wealth he squandered. He screamed that I was nothing but a vindictive, ungrateful parasite who got lucky because a dying old man felt sorry for the ugly, bitter daughter who could never find a suitable husband to take care of her. He yelled that forensic accounting was just a pathetic tool for cowards who did not know how to actually lead men or close real deals in the real world. He told me that taking his title today changed absolutely nothing because the logistics industry would never respect a woman like me sitting at the head of the table. He ranted that I had maliciously destroyed our entire family, ruined our spotless reputation in the church community, and humiliated him in front of his distinguished brothers just to stroke my own massive, uncontrollable ego. I let him scream. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the glass desk, and let the echo of his unhinged, desperate rage bounce around the boardroom. I did not raise my voice to interrupt him. I did not show a single ounce of fear, intimidation, or regret. I simply watched a broken man throw a violent temper tantrum because his stolen crown had finally been forcefully removed from his head. I waited until he was completely out of breath. I waited until his chest was heaving heavily, his expensive suit jacket was rumpled, and he was glaring at me with a look of pure, concentrated hatred that mirrored the exact way he had looked at me my entire life. I slowly turned my gaze away from his furious face. I looked down to the far end of the long glass table where Desmond, my grandfather, loyal lawyer, had been sitting in absolute terrified silence throughout the entire hostile takeover. I addressed him with a calm, chilling authority that cut right through the lingering heavy tension in the room. Desmond, I believe it is time to play Grandpa Contingency File, the one triggered by the CEO termination. Desmond nods slowly at my command. He reaches into his suit jacket and pulls out a small, secure remote control. He presses a single button. Instantly, the heavy motorized blackout blinds covering the floor-to-ceiling windows begin to descend. The bright Atlanta afternoon sun is systematically erased from the room, plunging the grand boardroom into sudden dramatic shadow. The ambient hum of the city traffic below is muffled. The only sound left is the synchronized mechanical whirring of the ceiling projector coming to life. A massive hidden screen drops down from the ceiling, rolling smoothly directly over the majestic oil portrait of Grandpa Elias. The irony is lost on no one sitting at the table. The painted, silent patriarch is being physically replaced by the living, breathing record of his final days. The screen flickers bright white for a fraction of a second, casting a harsh pale glow over the faces of the billionaires, over Connor's sweating brow, and over Warren's completely paralyzed form. The image resolves into crystal clear high-definition video. There he is, Grandpa Elias Sterling. He is sitting in the exact same high-backed leather executive chair that Warren just occupied and subsequently tipped over. The video was filmed perhaps a month before his heart finally gave out, but even ravaged by terminal illness, his presence commands absolute unquestionable obedience. He wears a sharp navy suit, his silver hair perfectly brushed, his dark eyes piercing right through the camera lens and seemingly into the very souls of everyone in the room. The silence is so absolute, so dense you could hear a pin drop on the thick carpet. Warren has stopped breathing altogether. Jada covers her mouth with her trembling hands, her ruined makeup smearing across her fingers. Connor looks exactly like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner slowly reach for the lever. Elias leans forward on the screen, resting his forearms deliberately on the familiar glass table. When he speaks, his deep baritone voice rumbles through the integrated surround sound speakers, vibrating against the rich mahogany walls. He does not offer a warm greeting. He does not offer comfort. He cuts straight to the bone. He says Warren's name with a heavy, exhausted disappointment that makes my father physically shrink back into his chair. Elias tells the camera that if this specific video file is playing, it means his greatest fear and his most precise calculation have both come true. It means Warren has been formally ousted from the chief executive officer position of Sterling Logistics by a majority vote of the board. Elias looks directly into the lens, locking eyes with his son across time and space. He tells Warren that he spent 30 grueling years trying to teach him the value of a single dollar earned through actual backbreaking labor. He reminds Warren that Sterling Logistics was not built in the comfortable lounges of the Buckhead Country Club. It was built during an era in Atlanta when a black man had to work 10 times harder, fight 10 times longer, and be 10 times smarter just to get a basic commercial loan approved by the banks. Elias built this empire with blood, sweat, and unrelenting punishing discipline. He handed Warren a golden key to a kingdom, and Warren used it to unlock the liquor cabinet and the underground gambling vault. The dead patriarch systematically strips away every delusion my father ever held about his own business acumen. Elias states for the official corporate record that Warren fundamentally lacked the discipline, the foresight, the strategic vision, and the basic integrity required to run a global supply chain empire. He calls out the shrinking profit margins that Warren tried to hide. He calls out the lost shipping contracts with the major retailers. He calls out the pathetic, desperate attempts to maintain a flashy socialite lifestyle while the company foundation actively rotted from the inside out. Warren sits completely frozen. His face is pale, his eyes wide with the sheer horror of being publicly dismantled by the only man he ever truly feared. The billionaire board members sitting around the table do not look away from the screen. They are watching the complete, irreversible decimation of their former golf buddy, realizing that Elias knew exactly how incompetent Warren was all along. Then Grandpa Elias shifts his gaze slightly. His eyes narrow with a sharp, undeniable disgust. He addresses Connor Pierce, the white finance bro who thought he could marry into generations of black wealth and slowly siphon it away while smiling and shaking hands at our Thanksgiving dinner table. Elias calls Connor exactly what he is, a mediocre, arrogant parasite. He tells the room that he knew about Connor failing cryptocurrency investments the exact moment they happened. He knew Connor was a financial fraud hiding behind an Ivy League degree his parents bought for him. He states clearly, his voice dripping with disdain, that he allowed Connor to enter the family, not because he approved of him, but because he needed a shallow containment zone for Jada vanity. Jada lets out a sharp, devastated sob, hearing her beloved grandfather reduce her entire existence to a vain, empty mistake. Elias addresses her briefly on the screen. He tells her that she chose a life of empty luxury over substance, character, and hard work. He tells her that she ignored every lesson he ever tried to teach her about the responsibility of wealth. He says that she would eventually have to pay the ultimate price for handing her trust fund and her future over to a thief who only saw her as a bank account. Jada buries her face in her arms on the table, weeping openly, as her entire reality is systematically erased by the man who funded it. The camera holds on Elias as he takes a slow, labored breath. The anger and disgust leave his face, replaced by a profound, overwhelming, and deeply moving pride. He looks back at the camera, but I know with absolute certainty he is looking directly at me. He says my name, Aaliyah. The tone shifts entirely. It is warm, steady, and filled with immense respect. He tells the silent boardroom about the years he spent watching me work in the shadows. He talks about finding me in the corporate archives at 2 in the morning, cross-referencing vendor invoices and analyzing tax codes, while the rest of the family was out drinking expensive champagne at charity galas. He acknowledges my absolute brilliance as a forensic accountant. He tells the room that I was the only person in the entire Sterling bloodline who actually understood the math, the long-term strategy, and the complex mechanics of the empire he built. He details the specific night in November 3 years ago when I caught a $3 million discrepancy in the regional shipping budget. He tells the board that Warren tried to write it off as a clerical error due to fuel costs, but I had stayed up for 48 hours straight, tracking the digital receipts to a ghost fleet that Connor had set up. Elias admits that he buried my report that day. He admits he told me I was overstepping my bounds and sent me back to my cubicle. He tells the camera that he saw the heartbreak in my eyes when he dismissed my hard work, but he did it to test my resolve. He watched me secretly build a separate encrypted server the very next day. He watched me refuse to give up. He tells the board that it was in that exact moment he realized I was not just a numbers cruncher. I was a hunter. I was the apex predator this company needed to survive the modern corporate landscape. He validates every single late night I endured. He validates every slight, every microaggression, every time Warren passed me over for a promotion in favor of a significantly less qualified man. He validates every time Jada mocked my tailored suits, my budget lifestyle, and my quiet, relentless focus. He says he saw it all. He saw them treat me like a burden, like a glorified bookkeeper, like a failure who did not fit into their glossy, superficial magazine covers. Elias confesses to the camera that breaking his own heart to watch me suffer was the absolute hardest thing he ever had to do in his entire life. But he explains exactly why he did not intervene. He tells the room that steel is not forged in a soft, comfortable fire. It requires intense, crushing pressure and blinding heat. He knew the sheer level of corruption, greed, and hostility I would have to face the moment he died. He knew Warren tried to destroy me to protect his own fragile ego. He knew Connor would try to steal the company blind. He knew Vivian would try to protect her country club status at all costs, even if it meant betraying her own daughter. He says he had to let them treat me like an outcast so I could learn how to survive among wolves. He had to let me build my armor. He knew I was the only one strong enough, smart enough, and ruthless enough to burn the infection out of the Sterling legacy and rebuild it from the ashes. Tears prick the corners of my eyes, a sudden hot wave of emotion threatening to break my composure, but I do not let them fall. I sit perfectly straight, my hands clasped together, absorbing the ultimate validation from the only person in my family who ever truly loved me. The board members are looking at me now, not with shock, not with fear, but with a deep, newfound reverence. They realize they are not just dealing with an angry, vindictive daughter. They are dealing with the chosen successor, the true heir forged in the fire by the founder himself. They are looking at the new sovereign of the Sterling Empire. Elias leans back in his leather chair on the screen. The pride in his eyes sharpens into a lethal, calculating glare. The grandfather is gone, replaced entirely by the ruthless business titan who built a logistics monopoly from scratch. He tells Warren that power is not something you are handed. It is not a title on a door, and it is certainly not a golf club membership. Power is the ability to see the board 10 moves ahead of your opponent. He tells Warren that while he was busy playing the role of the king, I was busy mastering the entire game. He issues his final directive. His voice drops an octave, carrying the heavy weight of absolute legal finality. He speaks to Warren one last time. He says, "Warren, if you are seeing this, it means you have been ousted from your position. And knowing your massive, incredibly fragile ego, it means you have likely destroyed the physical check I instructed Desmond to hand you today. You probably snatched it right off the table before Aaliyah could even touch it. You probably thought it was a brilliant display of power. You probably thought you were burning Aaliyah inheritance to teach her a lesson about your absolute authority." Elias smiles. It is a cold, brilliant, terrifying smile that I recognize instantly because I see it in my own reflection every morning. He tells Warren that the $40 million check was nothing but a piece of bait, a psychological trap designed specifically and exclusively for a narcissist who could not resist a theatrical show of dominance. He knew Warren would destroy the document to prove a point in front of the lawyers and the family. And by burning that check, Warren did exactly what Elias mathematically predicted he would do. Elias' voice rings out through the dark, silent boardroom, sealing my father's fate forever. By destroying that specific document, Warren, you have triggered the poison pill clause embedded deep in the company founding charter. The heavy projector screen rolled back into the ceiling with a quiet mechanical hum, leaving the boardroom bathed once again in the stark, unforgiving light of the Atlanta afternoon. The video file had ended, but my grandfather's deep, authoritative voice still seemed to echo off the mahogany walls. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Desmond stepped forward from the shadows at the end of the table. The elderly lawyer did not look frightened anymore. He looked like a man who had successfully delivered a devastating payload exactly as he was instructed to do by the man he respected most in the world. He unclasped his brushed leather briefcase and carefully withdrew a thick yellowed stack of papers bound by a heavy wax seal. It was the original founding charter of Sterling Logistics, drafted and signed in 1978. Desmond walked the length of the long glass table and stopped directly next to my father. He placed the heavy document right in front of Warren, directly over the spot where the ashes of the decoy check had finally been wiped away. Desmond spoke with a clinical, surgical precision. He informed Warren that he was looking at Section 4, Article 9 of the corporate charter, the poison pill. Desmond recited the exact legal phrasing from memory, his voice perfectly steady. He explained that the clause explicitly stipulated that any sitting executive who attempted to financially defraud, disinherit, or maliciously destroy the rightful assets of a direct blood heir of Elias Sterling would trigger an automatic, unappealable forfeiture of their corporate standing. By burning that certified check in front of witnesses, Warren had committed a documented act of financial malice against a direct heir. Desmond looked down at my father and delivered the killing blow. He stated that the forfeiture was instantaneous. Every single share of stock, every vested interest, every stock option, and every ounce of equity tied to the name Warren Sterling was officially voided. The charter mandated that those forfeited shares immediately revert directly back to the corporate treasury. Warren stared blindly at the yellowed parchment. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to press them flat against the glass table just to keep them steady. He opened his mouth to argue, stammering that a 50-year-old piece of paper would never hold up in a modern chancery court. He claimed his lawyers would have the clause thrown out by a judge before the week was over. Desmond simply adjusted his glasses and looked at my father with profound pity. He calmly informed Warren that Elias had quietly updated and legally reinforced the charter provision just 3 years ago. The Supreme Court of Georgia had already reviewed and upheld the exact legal framework of that specific trust mechanism in a separate corporate ruling last year. The trap was ironclad. There was no loophole. There was no appeal. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and decided to connect the final dots for him. I kept my voice incredibly calm, completely devoid of the manic rage he had displayed just minutes prior. I told him to do the math. The shares revert to the company treasury. The treasury is controlled entirely by the board of directors. I slowly gestured to the 5 billionaire logistics magnates sitting around the table, the men whose toxic personal debts I now legally owned. I reminded Warren of the unanimous vote that had taken place just moments ago. I control the board, I stated, making sure the reality settled deep into his bones. Therefore, I control the treasury. And that means I now control every single share of stock you just forfeited. I watched the realization hit him. The towering, arrogant patriarch of the Sterling family was suddenly stripped bare. I did not raise my voice, but my commands carried the weight of absolute authority. I told him that he owned absolutely nothing. I informed him that he was no longer a majority shareholder. He was no longer the chief executive officer. He was an unauthorized civilian sitting in a restricted corporate facility. I held out my hand, palm up. I demanded that he hand over his platinum corporate access badge. I demanded the keys to the executive elevator. I demanded the company-issued credit cards he used to fund his lavish lifestyle. Warren collapsed backward into his high-backed leather chair. The fight was completely and utterly drained from him. The broad-shouldered, booming giant who had terrorized our family for decades suddenly shrank into a pathetic, defeated old man. His custom-tailored suit looked too big for him. He stared at my outstretched hand, and then he slowly looked up into my eyes. The blistering, uncontrollable rage that had fueled his earlier temper tantrum was entirely gone. It was replaced by a desperate, manipulative vulnerability that made my stomach turn. He looked at me, waiting for me to show mercy. He was waiting for the little girl who had spent her entire life bringing home straight A's, working 80-hour weeks, and quietly cleaning up his financial disasters just to get a single fleeting nod of his approval. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, silently begging me to fix his mess. He wanted me to save him from his own hubris, just like Vivian always did. I stared right back at him, giving him absolutely nothing. My face remained a mask of cold, impenetrable stone. I looked at the man who had let me take the fall for my sister crimes. I looked at the man who had allowed a mediocre white finance bro to mock my intelligence at the Thanksgiving dinner table. I looked at the man who had gladly watched me suffer just to protect his own fragile ego. I felt no urge to comfort him. The desperate daughter who craved his love had died a long time ago, buried under years of his neglect and systemic abuse. I did not blink. I kept my hand extended, waiting for him to surrender his access. The heavy, oppressive silence of the boardroom was suddenly shattered by the frantic clicking of designer heels against the marble floor. Jada had been sitting in the corner, paralyzed by the rapid, violent dismantling of her entire reality. She had watched her husband exposed as a federal criminal. She had watched her father stripped of his wealth and power. She realized that the massive safety net she had relied on her entire life had just been incinerated. She rushed toward the center of the room, completely bypassing Connor, who was still pinned near the exit by corporate security. She shoved past Warren's chair and threw herself against the edge of the glass table right next to me. Jada was sobbing hysterically, her carefully curled hair plastered to her wet cheeks. She grabbed my arm with both of her hands, her manicured nails digging desperately into the fabric of my charcoal suit sleeve. She begged me for mercy. Her voice was shrill, completely devoid of the arrogant, mocking tone she had used against me for 30 years. She pleaded with me to give her the trust fund back. She swore she had no idea what Connor was doing behind her back. She begged me not to leave her with nothing, crying that she did not know how to survive without the sterling money. She gripped my arm tighter, her entire body shaking with violent sobs. She screamed that I had to help her because she was 2 months pregnant. She revealed the devastating truth that broke her completely. She sobbed that she desperately needed the family money to pay for her medical care and the baby future, because Connor had not just drained her offshore trust fund to pay for his crypto losses. She screamed that when she checked her phone during the meeting, she realized Connor had drained her personal checking accounts, maxed out every single credit card in her name, and left her completely and utterly destitute with a baby on the way. Sign it. I tell her, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the boardroom. Drop the thief. If you divorce Connor today and hand over his ledgers, I will personally pay for your medical care and the baby's future. I will give you a salary for a low-level admin job. Jada stares at the document resting on the polished mahogany table, her eyes wide with shock. Black mascara trails down her flushed cheeks, ruining the picture-perfect image she spent years constructing. The white paper in front of her carries the weight of her entire life. a legally binding total division of assets, and an immediate filing for dissolution of marriage. But if you stay with him, I continue stepping closer so she can hear every syllable over the hum of the air conditioner. You go down with him when the feds arrive, and I won't send a single cent to your commissary account. Don't you fucking dare touch that pen, Jada! Connor's roar shatters the room. His face is purple with rage sweat soaking through the collar of his tailored suit. He looks like a cornered animal frantically searching the room for an exit that no longer exists. She's bluffing. Look at her, she's trying to tear us apart. You're my wife, you stand by me. Jada looks at Connor, then turns her gaze back to the massive digital screen on the wall. The glowing numbers of the zero balance bank statement reflect in her tear-filled eyes. The offshore accounts, the dummy corporations, the secret shell funds he promised would secure their high society life, all wiped clean, seized and frozen by federal authorities. She looks at the man she chose over her own blood, realizing he has nothing left to give her but a shared prison cell. Slowly, her trembling hand reaches into her designer handbag and pulls out the leather-bound ledger Connor thought was hidden in his private safe. She slides it across the table toward me. "You bitch, you traitor!" Connor screams, snapping completely. He lunges across the boardroom table, his body hurling forward with violent force toward Jada's throat. Before he can make contact, two burly corporate security guards intercept him mid-air. They slam him violently face first against the glass wall of the conference room. The loud thud echoes like a gunshot, followed by the metallic click of heavy handcuffs locking around his wrists. Connor writhes against the glass, breathing heavily, cursing at the top of his lungs as security pins his arms behind his back. Jada doesn't even flinch. Without taking her eyes off me, she grabs my pen, clicks the top, and signs her name on the bottom line of the divorce papers with a sharp, swift movement. She slides the paper back to me, her breath shuddering. "It's done." Jada whispers, her voice trembling, stripped of all the arrogance she carried for 30 years. "I gave you the ledgers. I signed the paper. Save my baby." I pick up the signed document, inspect the signature, and hand it directly to my legal counsel standing beside me. "Get this filed with the court immediately. Notify the state prosecutor that Mrs. Jada Vance is cooperating fully as a material witness against Connor Vance." "What about my job? My money?" Jada pleads, pulling her knees toward her chest, as if trying to shrink into the leather chair. "You promised me a job, Maya. You promised to pay the medical bills." "You start on Monday at 8 in the morning," I say, looking down at her without a trace of pity. "Basement level 3 document scanning department. Minimum wage. You will report to a supervisor who won't hesitate to write you up if you are 1 minute late. Your medical expenses for the pregnancy will be remitted directly to the hospital billing department. You will never handle liquid cash, and you will never hold a title in this company again." Basement level. Jada gasps, her jaw dropping in disbelief. "Maya, I am your sister. I have a degree in communications. You can't put me in the basement with the mail clerks. You spent 10 years treating me like a maid in our parents' house." I reply, my tone icy and steady. "You let our mother give you my college fund while I worked 3 night shifts just to pay for textbooks. You lied to our family, called me a failure, and watched Connor steal my intellectual property while you drank champagne bought with stolen money. The basement is a privilege, Jada. If you don't like it, you can walk out that door right now and share a public defender with your husband." Jada closes her mouth, biting her lip so hard a drop of blood appears. She lowers her head, utterly defeated, acknowledging the brutal reality of her new life. "Take him down to the lobby and hand him over to the federal agents waiting downstairs." I order the security team. "This isn't over, Maya." Connor spits, his cheek still pressed against the glass as the guards pull him upright. "You think you won? You think you can just step in and take control of this board? The directors will never vote for you. My father owns 30% of the voting shares in this firm. He will tear you to pieces at the emergency board meeting." "Your father sold his shares 2 hours ago to cover his own margin calls, Connor," I say, pulling a fresh tablet from my bag and tapping the screen. "And the board members you think are loyal to you. They are currently in room 402 signing their resignations to avoid personal liability for your wire fraud." Connor's eyes widen in horror as the security guards haul him toward the double doors. His heels drag against the carpet, leaving deep grooves as he screams curses that fade down the long hallway. The boardroom grows deathly quiet. My legal team immediately begins gathering the files, closing laptops, and organizing the mountains of evidence that tore apart a multi-million-dollar empire in less than an hour. I turn my gaze toward the corner of the room where my mother has been standing in absolute silence. She looks smaller now, stripped of her expensive jewelry and the fake pride she wore like armor for decades. Her hands shake as she clutches her designer purse against her chest, looking at me, not as her daughter, but as a terrifying stranger who holds her entire world in the palm of her hand. Maya, my mother stammers, taking a hesitant step forward, her voice dripping with fake tenderness. My sweet girl, I knew you were always the smartest one. I always told your father that you had the strongest spirit in this family. Don't. I stop her instantly with a single raised hand. Do not pretend you loved me now that the child you favored is broken. I was blinded by Connor's money, Mother cries out, taking another step, her eyes welling with artificial tears. He lied to us all. He manipulated Jada. He manipulated me. I am your mother, Maya. You can't leave me with nothing. The house, the bank accounts. Connor put everything in his name. The bank is foreclosing on the mansion next week. I know, I say smoothly. I bought the note from the bank this morning. My mother stops dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. What did you say? I own the deed to the family mansion. I say, stepping closer until I am looking directly into her wide, panicked eyes. I bought the mortgage, the land, and every piece of furniture inside it. The house no longer belongs to the Vance estate. It belongs to my holding company. You bought our home, she whispers, her voice breaking. Then you're going to let me stay there, right? You wouldn't throw your own mother out on the street. The eviction notice will be served to you by 5 o'clock today, I say without a single flicker of emotion. You have 48 hours to pack your personal clothes. Anything bought with Connor's embezzled funds will be impounded by the asset recovery team tomorrow morning. You monster, Mother shrieks, her mask slipping completely as rage replaces her desperate plea. I gave birth to you, I raised you. How can you be so cold, so heartless? We are your family. Family. I chuckle, a dark, humorless sound that makes her flinch. Family doesn't leave their youngest daughter in a cold apartment with no heat during winter while they fly to Aspen. Family doesn't sign away my inheritance rights while I am lying in a hospital bed recovering from pneumonia. You chose your favorite child mother. Now you can live with the consequences of her failure. I turn away from her, addressing my assistant, who stands waiting near the door. Escort my mother out of the building. Revoke her security badge immediately. If she sets foot on company property again, have her arrested for trespassing. Maya, look at me, my mother screams, as two female security officers politely but firmly wrap their arms around her shoulders, turning her toward the exit. You will rot in hell for this. You hear me? You're a cold, unloving bitch. Her shrieks fade down the corridor as the heavy wooden doors swing shut, sealing the boardroom in complete peace. I walk over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The morning sun cuts through the glass, casting long shadows across the room. Below, two unmarked federal sedans pull up to the front entrance of the skyscraper. Down on the sidewalk, a crowd of reporters has already gathered, flashbulbs popping rapidly as Connor is led out in handcuffs, his head ducked low to avoid the cameras. My assistant walks up beside me holding a black leather folder. The emergency board meeting is scheduled for 2 o'clock, Miss Sterling. The major shareholders have already confirmed their attendance. They are ready to vote you in as the new chief executive officer unanimously. Good, I say, staring down at the chaotic scene on the street below. Has the press release been distributed to the financial news outlets? Yes, ma'am, the assistant confirms. The story broke 5 minutes ago. Vance Capital's stock has crashed 40%, but the announcement of your takeover has already stabilized the futures market. The press is calling it the most ruthless corporate restructuring of the decade. It wasn't a restructuring, I reply softly. watching my sister walk out the front doors alone carrying a single cardboard box containing her personal desk items, stepping right past the media frenzy without a single person recognizing her. It was an eviction. I turned back toward the empty boardroom table, picking up my leather briefcase. The 10-year nightmare was over, but the work was just beginning. I spent a decade being the invisible ghost in their lives, the background noise they ignored while they built their kingdom on my sweat and blood. Today, the kingdom was mine, and every single person who stepped on me to get to the top was going to learn what it felt like to stand at the bottom. My phone vibrates on the table. I pick it up and look at the screen. An unknown number from a federal detention center appears on the display. I tap the screen to answer and lift the phone to my ear. Maya, a raspy, desperate voice speaks from the other end of the line. It is my father, the man who had stayed silent for years, approving every cruel decision my mother and sister made, the man who had abandoned me the moment I refused to surrender my trust fund. Maya, please, they just arrested Connor. The police are at my door right now with a warrant for my arrest as an accessory to fraud. You have to help me, Maya. You're the only one with the power to stop the prosecutor. I hold the phone against my ear, listening to the heavy, panicked breathing of the man who was supposed to protect me when I was a child. Do you know what today is, Dad? I ask softly, my tone completely devoid of anger. What? What are you talking about? He stammers, his voice cracking with fear. Maya, please. The officers are knocking on the door right now. They're going to break it down. Today is the 10th anniversary of the day you removed my name from the family trust, I say, leaning against the edge of the conference table. You sat at this exact table, signed the paper, and told me that a daughter who doesn't contribute to the family legacy doesn't deserve a place in the family fortune. I was wrong. Connor forced my hand. Your mother forced me, he begs frantically. The sound of heavy wood splintering echoes through his end of the phone, followed by loud shouts of law enforcement officers demanding he get on the ground. Maya, please tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you authorized the transfers. I don't lie for strangers, I say quietly. Maya, don't hang up, Maya. I press the red button on the screen, terminating the call instantly. I place the phone back into my pocket, pull my blazer tight over my shoulders, and walk toward the double doors of the boardroom. The path ahead is clear, the past is burned to ashes, and for the first time in my life, I walk into the future on my own terms. I step out into the executive lobby, where 50 senior management staff members are standing in a double line waiting for me. As I walk past them toward the corner office that once belonged to Connor Vance, every single head bows in respect. My assistant opens the heavy glass doors to the primary executive suite. The vast room is immaculate, featuring a panoramic view of the entire city. On the massive glass desk sits a single silver nameplate, freshly polished and freshly engraved. I walk over to the desk, running my fingers over the cold metal letters that spell out my name, Maya Sterling, Chief Executive Officer. I sit down in the high-backed leather chair, open the central folder on the desk, and pick up my signature pen. The past is officially dead. The reign of the Vance family is over, and my empire has just begun. My assistant steps into the room holding a slender tablet. Miss Sterling, the prosecutor's office is on line 1. They want to know if you wish to press additional charges against your father for the fraudulent transfer of your mother's secondary offshore accounts. I look out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city spreading below me, feeling the cool, serene quiet of total victory. Tell the prosecutor, I say, clicking my pen to apply the absolute maximum penalty under the law. The assistant nods silently and exits the office, shutting the soundproof doors behind her. I slide the first official contract of my new company toward me, sign my name across the bottom line with absolute precision, and begin my first day at the top. 3 months passed in a blur of relentless restructuring and absolute legal devastation. The sweltering Atlanta summer heat had firmly settled over the city, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the heat bearing down on the people who had tried to destroy me. I sat in my expansive glass office overlooking the skyline, reviewing the final legal briefings from the federal prosecutor. The rapid collapse of my abusers was a masterclass in the exact forensic accounting principles my father had always mocked. When you sever the financial artery of a corrupt organism, the entire body dies very quickly. Warren Sterling was formally indicted on 47 counts of tax evasion, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. The federal agents had arrived at his temporary hotel room at 6 in the morning, dragging him out in handcuffs, while the local news helicopters hovered above. The man who had spent his entire life commanding boardrooms and terrifying his family was reduced to a stumbling, disoriented suspect on the morning broadcast. Because I had successfully triggered the corporate poison pill and handed the unredacted documents over to the Internal Revenue Service, Warren had absolutely no access to the Sterling corporate defense funds. His personal accounts remained frozen solid. He was forced to hire a discount defense attorney who looked completely overwhelmed standing next to him in federal court. The social execution was even more brutal than the legal one. The Buckhead elite, the men who used to smoke expensive cigars on our veranda and toast to his genius, completely excommunicated him. The Country Club Board of Directors held an emergency session and formally revoked his lifetime membership. They cited the exact same morality clause Warren had tried to use against me just 3 months prior. It was poetic justice delivered on a silver platter. When Warren tried to reach out to his old fraternity brothers and political contacts for character references or bail assistance, his calls went straight to voicemail. The Atlanta High Society operates on a very simple rule. They will tolerate a monster, but they will never associate with a broke, exposed fraud. He was an absolute ghost in the city he used to claim he owned. Connor Pierce thought his white privilege and his bought and paid for Ivy League degree would automatically shield him from the consequences of his actions. He genuinely believed that because he had married into a wealthy black family, he could drain our legacy and walk away clean. He was severely mistaken. During his bail hearing, the federal judge reviewed the mountain of forensic evidence my team provided. The judge looked at the sheer volume of offshore transfers, the dummy corporations, and the flight risk parameters, and slammed the gavel down hard. Bail was definitively denied. Connor was remanded entirely to federal holding awaiting a trial that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. The arrogant finance bro, who used to tap his luxury watch and tell me to leave the heavy lifting to the big boys, was now stripped of his custom-tailored suits. He traded his silk ties for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He was no longer a venture capitalist. He was just another 8-digit federal inmate number stamped across his chest. He sits in a concrete cell for 23 hours a day, eating lukewarm cafeteria food, finally crunching his own numbers. He has to wake up every single morning and calculate the fact that he will be 50 years old before he ever sees a golf course again. Without Warren's stolen money and Connor fraudulent infusions, my mother hit rock bottom with terrifying speed. Vivian had built her entire identity, her entire worth as a human being around her proximity to wealth and social status. When the bank officially foreclosed on the Sandy Springs mansion, she was given exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. My asset recovery team stood in the foyer with clipboards ensuring she only packed personal clothing and nothing purchased with embezzled corporate funds. Vivian was forced to downsize to a cramped, noisy 2-bedroom condo way outside the city perimeter, right next to a busy interstate highway. Without the sterling money shielding her, the harsh reality of her situation set in immediately. I received updates from the private investigator I kept on retainer just to monitor the asset seizures. He sent me photographs of Vivian standing in the sweltering afternoon heat outside a luxury consignment shop in Buckhead. The woman who used to host charity galas was now haggling desperately over the resale value of her vintage designer bags just to afford her monthly utility bills and groceries. Her carefully curated circle of society friends abandoned her overnight. The women from her church committees, the prominent sorority sisters, and the politicians' wives completely deleted her number from their phones. Vivian had spent 30 years looking down on people who struggled, and now she was entirely invisible. When you build your entire personality around what you can buy, you cease to exist the second your bank account hits zero. She was left alone in a tiny apartment surrounded by the cheap echoes of the luxurious life she threw her own daughter under the bus to protect. But the most profound, satisfying transformation was happening right beneath my feet. Down on basement level 3 of the newly rebranded Sterling Corporate Tower, the air was thick with the smell of toner ink and cardboard. Jada actually showed up that first Monday morning at exactly 7:45. She had absolutely no other choice. With Connor assets seized and her own trust fund drained dry, she was facing total destitution. I gave her the lowest level administrative job in the building, and my human resources director made sure the employment terms were strictly enforced. Jada underwent a brutal physical and psychological shift. The designer stilettos were quickly traded for sensible rubber-soled flat shoes. Her perfect expensive manicures were ruined within the first week by rough cardboard boxes and sharp paper cuts. She spends 8 hours a day standing over a massive commercial scanner, digitizing decades of old shipping manifests. She is surrounded by the exact type of working-class everyday people she spent her entire life mocking from the comfort of her luxury vehicles. She has to scan an employee badge to enter the building. She has to clock in and out on a digital timesheet. She is allotted exactly 30 minutes for lunch, and if she takes 32 minutes, her supervisor docks her pay. She is learning for the very first time in her 30 years of life what the crushing, exhausting weight of actual labor feels like. She is finally learning what it takes to earn a paycheck. It is a Tuesday morning. The Atlanta sun is pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office. My assistant buzzes my desk intercom, her voice crisp and professional. She informs me that the morning executive mail delivery has arrived. The heavy glass door opens. Jada walks into the office that used to belong to our father. She is wearing a plain gray cardigan and dark slacks. She looks exhausted. There are dark circles under her eyes, and her posture is stripped of all the haughty arrogance she used to carry like a weapon. She is holding a stack of sorted manila envelopes in one hand and a ceramic mug of hot black coffee in the other. She walks across the plush carpet, her eyes fixed on the floor. She stops at the edge of my massive desk. She carefully sets the sorted mail down, making sure the edges are perfectly aligned just the way I require. Then she places the coffee mug gently next to my keyboard. Her hands are shaking slightly. She looks up at me, her eyes lingering for just a fraction of a second. I know exactly what she is looking for. She is looking for a sisterly smile. She is looking for a tiny crack in my armor. She is hoping for a sigh, a soft look, or some small indication that the punishment is over and I will finally rescue her from the basement. I give her absolutely nothing. I do not smile. I do not frown. My face remains a mask of calm, untouchable authority. I look up from my quarterly profit projections. I look directly into the eyes of the woman who watched me suffer for years and did nothing but laugh. Thank you, Ms. Vance. I say, my voice completely flat and entirely professional. I reach out, take a sip of the hot coffee, and immediately return my eyes to the glowing computer screen. I dismiss her with a single subtle nod toward the door. Jada swallows hard. I can see the reality of her permanent situation finally solidifying in her mind. The boundary is absolute. There is no redemption arc for her here, only the cold, hard consequence of her own choices. She lowers her head turns around and walks quietly back out of the glass doors, heading straight back down to the basement where she belongs. The heavy frosted glass doors glide shut with a soft mechanical click, sealing the executive suite in absolute silence. I watch my sister walk away through the transparent walls of my office, knowing she will spend the rest of her life paying for the arrogance she once wore so proudly. I take a deep breath of the cool, conditioned air and slowly turn my attention back to the sprawling room around me. The transformation of this space is the physical manifestation of my absolute victory. For over a decade, this room belonged to my father. Warren ran this company from a dark, oppressive cave constructed of heavy mahogany paneling, thick velvet drapes, and the lingering, suffocating scent of expensive imported cigars. His office was designed to intimidate, to make anyone who walked through those doors feel small and insignificant. It was a monument to a toxic patriarchal regime built on exclusion and unearned authority. I had demolition crews in here the very weekend after my hostile takeover. I ordered them to rip up the thick carpets and tear down every single piece of that dark wood. I replaced the shadows with blinding, brilliant light. Now, the entire executive suite is a masterpiece of sleek floor-to-ceiling glass polished steel and pristine white marble. The design is intentionally transparent. Nothing can hide in the dark here anymore. Every single transaction, every handshake, and every corporate decision is brought out into the unforgiving light of day. I sit behind a massive custom-cut glass desk that overlooks the entire sprawling skyline of Atlanta. The view stretches from the towering skyscrapers of Midtown all the way down to the bustling logistical hubs in the West End. It is my city now. The physical renovation of the office was incredibly satisfying, but the structural renovation of the company itself was my true masterpiece. I did not just take the chief executive officer title. I completely eradicated the corrupt boys' club culture that Warren had allowed to infect my grandfather's legacy. Warren had promoted mediocre men based purely on their golf handicaps and their country club pedigrees, while actively silencing the people who actually kept the business running. During my first official week in power, I initiated a brutal, uncompromising forensic audit of the entire human resources department. I terminated every single regional manager and vice president who had coasted on nepotism or turned a blind eye to Connor's massive embezzlement scheme. I stripped the executive branch down to its studs. I replaced that rot with ruthless, absolute efficiency. I promoted the brilliant women and marginalized professionals who had been doing the actual heavy lifting in the shadows for decades. I instituted automated real-time forensic auditing software across our entire global network, ensuring that no one would ever be able to siphon a single dime from this company again. I stripped away the bloated, deceitful corporate culture and restored Grandpa Elias' original uncompromising vision of honest, grueling labor. But I infused his old-school foundation with my own modern, relentless precision. Sterling Logistics is no longer a sluggish, dying dinosaur bleeding cash to fund the lavish lifestyles of Atlanta elite. We are a streamlined, predatory force dominating the southern supply chain market. I lean back in my ergonomic leather chair, resting my hands on the cool glass surface of my desk. I take a long, quiet moment to reflect on the absolute magnitude of this journey. The sheer gravity of what I have accomplished over the last 3 months finally settles deep into my bones. I look down at my hands. They are steady. They are powerful. I remember a time when these same hands used to shake with anxiety every time my father raised his voice. I remember being a little girl hiding in my bedroom while my mother threw lavish society parties, praying that none of her wealthy friends would notice my quiet demeanor or my lack of designer clothes. I remember my sister parading her privileged life through the hallways, constantly making sure I knew my place was at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. For 32 years, they tried to write my story for me. They labeled me the ugly, bitter daughter. They called me a glorified bookkeeper. They told me I lacked the stamina, the charisma, and the pedigree to ever sit at the head of a boardroom table. They constructed a massive false narrative designed entirely to keep me small so that their profound mediocrity could look impressive by comparison. They expected me to simply accept my role as the family scapegoat and quietly clean up their financial disasters until the day I died. But I did not just survive their relentless psychological warfare. I weaponized it. I took every insult, every microaggression, and every moment of profound disrespect, and I used it to sharpen my mind into a lethal instrument. I did not merely take their money. Money is just a tool. I took their power. I completely dismantled their false narratives piece by piece in front of the very people they desperately wanted to impress. I stripped them of their social armor, their fraudulent wealth, and their untouchable arrogance. I reclaimed total and absolute control over my own life. I turned my chair slightly, looking at my reflection in the massive pane of glass against the backdrop of the bright blue Georgia sky. The woman looking back at me is unrecognizable from the quiet, compliant auditor who walked into that boardroom 3 months ago. I am the youngest and the most powerful Black female chief executive officer in the entire logistics industry. I command an empire that moves billions of dollars in freight across the globe every single day. I do not ask for a seat at the table anymore. I own the building the table sits in. The heavy glass doors of my suite glide open, breaking my silent reflection. My lead corporate counsel walks into the room carrying a thick leather-bound portfolio. He approaches my desk with a deep, respectful nod and places the documents directly in front of me. It is the final paperwork for a massive new acquisition deal. We are officially buying out the largest remaining competitor in the state, expanding our territory across the entire eastern seaboard. The terms are aggressive, uncompromising, and entirely in our favor. I slowly open the leather cover and review the executive summary. The numbers are flawless. The strategy is absolute perfection. I reach across my desk and pick up my custom solid gold fountain pen. The cool metal feels heavy and purposeful in my grip. I turn to the signature page at the very back of the contract. I sign my name with smooth, sharp, aggressive strokes, permanently sealing the expansion of my empire. I close the leather portfolio and slide it back toward my attorney, signaling that the deal is officially done. I set my pen down gently on the pristine glass surface. I fold my hands together, resting them quietly on my desk. I look straight ahead, staring directly into the metaphorical camera with a calm, terrifying certainty. They thought they could burn me out of my legacy. They forgot that fire doesn't destroy everything. Sometimes fire just hardens the steel. True power is never given freely. It must be strategically reclaimed. When toxic family members attempt to extinguish your light to mask their own deep failures, your calculated silence is not a weakness. It is your absolute ultimate weapon. You never need to beg for a seat at a table built entirely on lies when you have the brilliance and resources to buy the whole building. Blood does not always equate to loyalty, and walking away from abuse is profound healing. Please share your incredible empire-building survival stories in the comments section below.